Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about my final fight analysis, my fight breakdown, and my fight review of the David Benavidez versus David Morrell fight, which, of course, was a very decent fight. Of course, we've seen both gentlemen, really lay it on the line, in certain parts of the fight. Both gentlemen, try to win, and, pretty much what I had predicted for the fight pretty much ended up, turning up. David Benavidez ended up beating that of David Morrell. I thought that he had beat him quite handily. Now, that's not me stating that David Benavidez, that he didn't have tough moments in the fight. Of course, there was a balanced shot knockdown, I believe, in either the 10th or the 11th round. I can't remember. But, of course, David Benavidez got knocked down. There was a couple of very good power shots that ended up landing. But there wasn't really ever a moment within this fight that I ever thought that David Morrell, that he was going to be majorly in control of this fight. And I want to talk about both fights, not just with David Benavidez and David Morrell, but of course also with Brandon Figueroa and Steven Fulton. Now, I ended up getting one of my fight predictions correct and one of my fight predictions wrong about who would end up winning the fight. Brandon Figueroa ended up losing to Mr. Steven Coolboy Fulton, but nothing really about that fight really surprised me, and nothing about the David Benavidez versus David Morrell fight really surprised me either. But I kind of want to talk about it because, like I always state on this channel, many people take a look at certain fighters, or they take a look at certain particular athletes or certain things, and they pretty much use their surface level intuition. They don't really analyze it with a great amount of depth or with a great amount of detail, or actually seeing overall what that particular fighter, what they may have in their pocket or in their toolbox over that of the other fighter. Even when people take a look at certain fights and they like to analyze certain fights, they don't really know in particular what they're actually analyzing or what to look for. And what I stated in my fight prediction is that even though many people predicted that David Morrell was going to be this quote unquote slick, Cuban black fighter from the Cuban boxing school, like a Guillermo Rigondeaux or an Araceli Lara, I told people heading into the fight that that is not something that I ended up seeing, that he comes across to me as someone that is a straightforward fighter that does not really have anywhere near as good a feet or as good a defense or slick maneuverability as what people try to let on. And then I said that in my personal view, that a lot of people, that they were kind of just alleging that because he is a Cuban boxer. And I pretty much ended up being proven right on every single one of those accounts. Now, the fight was very competitive, but also to compare it, to that of the Steven Fulton versus Brandon Figueroa fight, those two fights, what they were really in contrast is that one was the perception of actual reality, and one was the perception of a little bit of surface level analyzation. And what I mean by that is that many people took a look at the David Morrell versus David Benavidez fight and said, oh, this is going to be, a lot like Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Nonito Donaire. Or this is going to be like Araceli Lara versus, maybe a pressure fighter in his career or something like that. Once again, when I looked at both David Benavidez and David Morrell within their particular fights, I knew that David Benavidez, that not only was he going to have more experience compared to David Morrell, but he was the all-around more skilled fighter. And certain people overall may take a look at that on the surface. They may take a look at David Benavidez as someone that is just a come-forward Mexican fighter. And yes, mainly what David Benavidez likes to do is that he does like to come forward, and he mainly does have success coming forward. But he's also better in the mid-range than what a David Morrell is. And believe it or not, there's even certain times where he's a little bit better on the back foot than what David Morrell is. It's no offense against David Morrell, but really I think that the main reason why this fight was competitive, especially in some of the latter rounds, was because David Benavidez, and this is not something that I expected, this is a thing that did catch me a little bit off guard. I did not expect David Benavidez to really have such a lack of stamina within this fight. And I mean, we kind of seen it a little bit in the Alexander Gvozdyk fight, against the former champion, where, clearly Gvozdyk, he was going to use his size to a certain degree, and David Benavidez, that was really his first fight at the 175-pound weight class. But I didn't really make a whole lot of it because I was like, well, maybe this is just his first fight there. And he's always showed a great gas tank, at least usually at 168 pounds. So I'm not really gonna fret over it too much, so we'll kind of see what happens in this next fight against David Morrell. But I expected David Benavidez to have better stamina. David Benavidez, if you really take a look at this fight, he really was breathing heavy and sweating his ass off after the first 5 or 6 rounds of this fight, which I think is a big part of the reason why David Morrell was able to take advantage of certain situations. And it's not like David Morrell necessarily had, a whole lot of offense going in this fight, or really had the best of gas tanks himself. But at the end of the day, he definitely was able to take advantage of certain things because David Benavidez's gas tank, in my personal view, it was compromised, at least compared to what it usually had been. Now, is it going to continue being like this at the 175-pound weight class? Who knows? Of course, it is only his second fight there. But it does appear that David Benavidez, that he's having a little bit of a problem, at least being the same fighter at the 175-pound weight class. And I thought that maybe the first fight against Gvozdyk, I said, okay, maybe David Benavidez, he's getting adjusted to the power and he's getting adjusted to the weight. But it appears that David Benavidez, that he does not really have an elite level gas tank at this weight class. But pretty much stating about David Morrell, David Benavidez, in my view, did clearly win this fight. I scored the fight at about 8 rounds to 4 at the most, overall for David Morrell giving 4 rounds. I think that, to be honest with you, that's even being a little bit charitable. I really gave Morrell more about 2 or 3 rounds within the fight, to be quite honest with you. I thought that David Benavidez had won the majority of the rounds. I think that David Morrell maybe had a couple of good rounds where he caught Benavidez, maybe being a little bit tired and pulling back so he would not exhaust himself to complete exhaustion. But David Morrell, once again, pretty much proved to me to be what I thought that he was. A fighter that, once again, a lot of people stated would be this slick Cuban fighter that was going to be great on the back foot and set up traps. And it just goes to show you that, once again, that many people, they don't analyze certain boxing fighters or fights in a certain amount of depth, that they only make certain surface level intuitive guesses, which is not enough when you break down a boxing level fight. But of course, my complete predictions about every fight of this fight or this fight card was not completely correct either. Because, of course, Brandon Figueroa ended up getting completely outshined and outboxed again by that of a Steve-on Coolboy Fulton. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. But like I stated, David Morrell, a lot of his better attacks were on the front foot. They were when he was coming forward. You did not really see any particular great trap set up by that of a David Morrell or within the mid-range or on that of the back foot, like what you've seen with Araceli Lara, say, for example, against Canelo Alvarez, where he would have a great counter jab over the top, or, he would kind of set David Benavidez up through the guard with the left hand. You really didn't see a whole lot of that. When David Morrell would have success, oftentimes it was because he was countering David Benavidez when he would keep both of his hands down, or maybe at a particular time when he was up against the ropes, or maybe when David Benavidez was getting a little bit tired, or when David Benavidez was throwing certain combinations and he tried to throw that little overhand over the top, which I stated David Morrell would end up doing. But the thing is once again, is that I pretty much guessed, from what I had seen, that David Benavidez, that he was pretty much going to be more skilled in a lot of categories than that of David Morrell, which, once again, certain people taking a look at it on the surface, they may not realize. But David Benavidez is a better defensive fighter than David Morrell. He's faster than David Morrell, at least in terms of the hand speed. And on top of that, he can probably fight in a little bit more of a multitude of ways than what a David Morrell can. David Morrell, apparently has this great amateur experience, but once again, what I had seen in the professionals, it didn't translate. And he comes across to me, and I know that certain people are going to disagree with this, but he comes across to me as a relatively one-dimensional fighter that really is not super great within the mid-range, nor is great on the back foot. I think that he's at his best when he is really pressuring, or when he's trying to cut off the ring, or when he's really trying to break down his opponent on the front foot. But within the mid-range, David Benavidez was mainly able to outbox him. He out-jabbed him, he out-countered him, whether it was on the inside or on the outside, or whether it was that of the mid-range, David Benavidez was mainly able to out-counter him, which is what I had predicted. But that being stated, just taking a look at this fight, or David Benavidez going forward, do I believe that David Benavidez is going to defeat the best version of a Dimitri Bivol or an Artur Beterbiev after this fight? No, personally, I don't. And I didn't think that the best version of David Benavidez was going to defeat either Dimitri Bivol or Artur Beterbiev. But if Artur Beterbiev ends up winning that rematch against Dimitri Bivol, and if Artur Beterbiev ends up facing David Benavidez, David Benavidez better pray to God that he ends up getting a better gas tank for that fight, because Artur Beterbiev is going to put the hurting on you. Unless Artur Beterbiev completely underestimates David Benavidez and just completely tries to outbox within the mid-range the whole entire time and doesn't try to pressure David Benavidez and really try to hurt him, I don't see how David Benavidez ends up winning that fight, especially with the way that it looks like his power is clearly, less impactful at this personal weight class, especially when he fights guys that are more similar in size to him. I always told people this. David Benavidez is not a guy that is an A+ level puncher. He is an A- level puncher. He has to get you with punches in bunches. And of course, he was able to knock out Demetrius Bubo Andrade, but Andrade was kind of first moving up to that weight class. I believe that it was either his first or second fight there. And on top of that, Andrade was always a guy that would kind of tire out in the latter part of fights anyways. And he was a guy that, I'm not going to claim that he was super chinny, but he was a guy that could be hurt. We had seen that within a multitude of fights. But anyways, when it comes to this weight class, it appears clearly that David Benavidez, that he's not really the same Mexican monster. And I kind of expected that to a degree, but I did not expect it to have such a deep impact. I expected David Benavidez to at least have a very good gas tank throughout the majority of the fight. And to be quite honest with you, even though, of course, he threw clearly, the more punches, if it's going to be up against Artur Beterbiev, who does not really have a problem with much of a gas tank, overall within his fights, or Dimitri Bivol, he's going to be in deep shit. And he's going to have to really watch out, for that fight. He's going to have to really watch out for that. But to move on from that, to talk about Mr. David Morrell, where does David Morrell end up going from here? Well, we'll see where he ends up going from here. I think that Morrell has some slight talent. I don't think that he's anywhere near as talented as what people really try to say that he is. I think that once again that he's really only good within one range, and that is really the front foot range. But it is what it is. But we'll see what he ends up doing. Of course, he only has 12 total fights now with this one loss against a former 168-pound champion and now the current 175-pound champion in David Benavidez. So like I said, we'll see what ends up happening a little bit later on. But David Morrell, the fights that I would really like to see him in at the 175-pound weight class, I'm not really quite sure where he goes from here. But just in my personal view, would I see him beating a Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev? Absolutely not. And to be quite honest with you, he would be very lucky if he didn't get stopped in both of those fights. Now, the question is, what other fighters can he potentially fight there? And I don't really know or remember what other fighters are there, but an interesting fight that someone actually proposed was him versus Anthony Yarde. And that would be a very interesting task because, of course, Anthony Yarde is someone that, of course, was, a former great contender within that weight class. Maybe Callum Smith, if Callum Smith, of course, can win, overall at that, in his next fight. And I'm going to be quite real with you. I'm not really 100% sure if David Morrell is going to win either of those fights. But we'll see overall what ends up happening there. He can because, of course, he has less wear and tear than some of those guys. Both Callum Smith and that of Anthony Yarde, they've been stopped before, both against Artur Beterbiev. But, when you talk about it, and of course, Anthony Yarde, Sergey the Crusher Kovalev as well. But, once again, it would still be very interesting to see if David Morrell can really build on his skill set. But once again, pretty much what I thought of David Morrell pretty much ended up transpiring within this fight. Now, to move on to the Steven Fulton versus Brandon Figueroa fight, which was a complete clinic, I believe, by that of a Steven Coolboy Fulton. The most amount of rounds I think that you could have gave to Brandon Figueroa was 4 rounds, and to be honest with you, that's even being a little bit charitable. I think that more than likely Brandon Figueroa probably really won more about 2 rounds, and certain people were a little bit surprised. Even Abner Mares went as far to state that he thought that there was something quote-unquote wrong with that of a Brandon Figueroa. But to be honest with you, I don't think that anything was really wrong with the Brandon Figueroa. I just think that Brandon Figueroa, that he doesn't really have the type of fight style to beat someone like a Steven Fulton. Brandon Figueroa is not someone that fights great in a multitude of ways. And at the beginning of the fight, I noticed immediately that he looked like he was trying to out-jab that of a Steven Coolboy Fulton. And as soon as I seen that first round, I said, he's not going to win this fight. And the reason why I said that is because if he tries to outbox Steven Fulton, he is not going to win this fight. Because Steven Fulton is completely better than him in the long range, and he's also better than him in the mid-range. Fulton has a way better jab than what he does. And that's why I said, the Castro fight that Steven Fulton had, it's not going to be completely the same as the Brandon Figueroa fight, because Castro actually knows how to use his height and his length. He has a very good jab. Brandon Figueroa has a jab, but it's really not it's really not something that has the greatest amount of intelligence behind it. It's really just more of a probing jab, and it's really to set up other punches. And one thing that I did not notice about Brandon Figueroa when I had rewatched the fights that I should have is that Brandon Figueroa, a lot of the times when he ends up countering certain guys, he really wants you to be first. Brandon Figueroa, a lot of people take a look at him and they look at pressure fighters and they say, oh, well, they're going to be first and they're going to try to break you down. Well, sometimes. But sometimes certain fighters really want you to throw over the top of their head or over the top so they can then in return slip under it and really dig to the body with the uppercuts. And Brandon Figueroa was trying to do that, but Steven Fulton was so defensively responsible and so quick and was landing all the more impactful shots throughout the main majority of the fight, even on the inside range. And the disability, or at least the disadvantages that I thought Fulton was going to have with the size disadvantage, turned into an advantage for Steven Fulton because he used his shorter arms, or at least overall his smaller stature, to the advantage when he was clearly quicker on the inside against Brandon Figueroa to land some of those body shots. he would just wait for Brandon Figueroa to kind of get on the inside range, throw 1-2-3s, or 1-2s or 1-2-3s, and then, pretty much cover up back outside of the range, let Brandon Figueroa throw his little slapping punches or his probing jab, and then he'd return overall either with the clinch and suffocate his offense, or he'd return with a couple of other power shots. Brandon Figueroa just fought the complete wrong type of fight in order to beat someone like a Stephon Fulton. And I did notice that watching in some of his fights, like against a Mark Magsayo or a Castro, that Brandon Figueroa, that he was trying to be a little bit more technically sound within those fights by working off his jab a little bit more, working off of the mid-range, and that was the completely wrong type of fight to fight against a Stephon Coolboy Fulton. Because Brandon Figueroa, there are certain times to where you have to understand your limitations. There are certain times to where you cannot beat that fighter in that particular range. You have to know your skill set. You have to know both your strengths and your weaknesses. And Brandon Figueroa apparently did not know his weaknesses, and he also did not know enough of his opponent's strengths and did not learn enough from that first fight. Because he thought to a certain amount of the time that he could let Stephon Coolboy Fulton be first within the fight with a clear hand speed advantage, and on top of that, someone who is great pretty much within a multitude of ranges, and he thought that Stephon Coolboy Fulton could be first and that he could out-counter him. That was not going to work. He was going to have to completely break him down, suffocate him throughout the whole entire fight, really whoop those uppercuts to the body, then kind of back out of the range. If you want to back out of the range after that to make sure you're not getting hit, that's fine. But he would stay within the range, pretty much pause there for, a couple of seconds, let Fulton get off, and then he would try to throw right after that. But Fulton a lot of the times would throw correctly, during certain, when Brandon was about to punch, or during certain combinations that he pretty much paused his offense. So overall, once again, Brandon Figueroa, although I'm not surprised that he lost, it was a little bit of a disappointing performance because, of course, it would have been nice to see at least a very competitive fight. But, of course, it's great to see Stephon Fulton back in the ring, even though I don't know what the fuck he was wearing, but, it is what it is with the Timberlands and, overall that little jean, overall, those jean shorts, whatever the hell those were. But, anyways, when it comes down to it, Stephon Fulton, he had a very great performance. And it just goes to show you the caliber of fighter that not only a Stephon Fulton is, but also the caliber of fighter that someone like Inoue is, the level of boxer and athlete that he has to be in order to even be a little bit smaller than a Stephon Fulton. And Fulton is clearly smaller than Brandon Figueroa. He's clearly at least a weight class smaller than Brandon Figueroa. And the fact that Inoue was able to dominate Stephon Fulton, it shows you the caliber of fighter and boxer that he actually is. Because he was able to completely outbox Stephon Fulton within that fight. And even Brandon Figueroa did not have anywhere near the same level of impact. Someone who's a very hard puncher and someone that, of course, is very suffocating in his offense, but he just had nowhere near the level of dimensions or depth in terms of his boxing ability as an Inoue. And I mean, that was obvious coming into the fight anyway, but, Brandon Figueroa, I thought that there was a potentiality that the less wear and tear on him would maybe give him the victory. And then on top of that, him being at a new weight class, him being a little bit possibly more powerful, but it just wasn't anywhere near impactful because Brandon Figueroa did not use his power, nor did he use his offense in the right way. He had to be first within this fight. He had to be. And he was just way too reactionary within this fight. And you can't beat an elite level boxer like a Fulton, at least for those weight classes, not being the first puncher. You just have to be. If you're going to be a brawler, then you have to be a brawler all the way. You have to be first. You have to be aggressive. You have to be unpredictable. And there was nothing about Brandon Figueroa within that fight that was super aggressive nor unpredictable. He was very predictable. But it is what it is. But anyways, I just thought that I would talk about those fights. I thought that it was very particularly interesting. Great on both Stephon Fulton and Mr. David Benavidez. I thought that had David Benavidez had a better gas tank, or at least the same gas tank that I had seen at 168, I think that he probably would have got a stoppage somewhere around the 9th or 10th rounds. But David Benavidez's gas tank and stamina clearly looked affected. It did not look anywhere near the same in my personal view, which surprised me a little bit because I thought that he was kind of draining himself a little bit at 168. But of course, it's also a little bit draining when you're fighting guys that are bigger than you're usually used to fighting, and you're fighting guys that can compete with your power, are not as affected by your power, are not as moved back. And then on top of that, they're countering you with some of your exchanges that you're not usually used to because they're used to that level of power. And on top of that, they can counter you a little bit back, with some good power of their own. So I didn't expect David Benavidez to have the exact same gas tank within, 168, but I definitely didn't expect it to be this level of impact because David Benavidez usually was known for an excellent A+ level gas tank. But honestly, within this fight, it looked about B+ to be quite honest with you at best. So I mean, we'll see what ends up happening, but would I predict him to beat the winner of the Bivol versus Better Beef rematch? No, personally, I would not. I would not. And within that fight, I am predicting Better Beef to win that fight again, but we'll see what happens. But that pretty much is about it for my fight review. Very good on Mr. Steve Von Folden and also on that of David Benavidez. The fights, pretty much, or at least the fight went down as what I thought it was going to go with David Benavidez winning that fight. I thought that Brandon Figueroa was going to be a little bit more aggressive, but to be quite honest with you, even though I find myself to be a good boxing analyzer, I made a little bit of an error in terms of overall some of Brandon Figueroa's, and how first or how, how domineering he was going to be within the fight. But it is what it is. But that was a very close fight coming in, but very good on Steve Von Folden and very good on David Benavidez. But let me also state this: one of the fighters that I really thought had a great performance, Mr. Jesus Ramos. That dude, in my view, is a very special fighter. Now, of course, he has one loss in his career against Erickson Lubin, a fight that, to be honest with you, I kind of thought that he kind of got a little bit jobbed in. But to be fair, I would have to rewatch the fight. I haven't watched that fight in a while. But Jesus Ramos, in my view, is a very special fighter. I would love to see him in a rematch against Erickson Lubin, or against maybe some other fighters. And of course, he ended up fighting Jason Rosario. This is why I say, like, when people bring up the Terrence Crawford versus Jeff Horn situation, they say, oh, well, Jeff Horn ended up beating Manny Pacquiao, right? But there are certain fighters, and there's a few of these fighters in every single generation where they end up winning the title because either A, that fighter probably did not train properly for that fight or heavily underestimated them, or that they were just a perfect counter for them, and they really are not a championship level caliber fighter. Jason Rosario was one of those fighters. Jeff Horn was one of those fighters. Buster Douglas was one of those fighters, at least to a certain degree. Leon Spinks was one of those fighters. There's a fighter, there's a fighter like that in every single generation to a degree. Ricardo Mayorga, when he beat a Vernon Forrest, those are fighters that when they win belts, you realize that when they finally face a guy that not only is an elite level champion or a very good champion, but someone that is finally going to take them seriously and not just overlook them, that they're pretty much going to get their ass kicked. And that's happened with Jason Rosario every time that he's been in a seriously big fight or in a serious, serious big fight after that of the Julian J. Rock Williams fight. Someone who has been known at times to be a little bit defensively irresponsible and sometimes underestimate opponents, and be a little bit chinny, to be quite honest with you. But it is what it is. That's why I said when Jamel Charlo was knocking out those guys at 154, those guys are not elite level, A-grade level fighters. Jason Rosario is a very one-dimensional, very basic fighter that has no special effects. Same with Erickson Lubin, same with some of those other guys, but it is what it is, besides Brian Castano, of course. But anyways, that pretty much is about it. But I thought that I would talk about that, but to talk about Jesus Ramos really quickly, I would love to see him in a couple of fights. I would love to see him maybe with the winner of Virgil Ortiz versus Israel Madrimov, maybe a Terrence Bud Crawford, if Crawford would want to take that fight, or, perhaps maybe an Errol Spence Jr., or a rematch with Erickson Lubin. I would love to see any one of those fights. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for my final fight breakdown and my final fight analysis and my final fight review. Let me know what you guys saw, but that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later. But, just to end off on the note once again about Benavidez versus Morrell, like I stated, I did not see Morrell as someone that was a Rigondeaux or a Lara. Rigondeaux and Lara, they can set you up for traps. They can keep you, somewhat enticed, while you're coming in, but they also have very good feet. They have very quick feet, and they know how to set you up with certain traps and combinations, and not just combinations, but great counters coming into their range. David Morrell does not have that ability. Lara and both Rigondeaux, they have a great jab counter over the top and a great educated jab and lead hand over the top. David Morrell does not have that. He has a great stabbing jab at times, but it's not a great lead hand. He's never had that. When you talk about, the footwork of a Lara and a Rigondeaux, he doesn't have the footwork, the foot speed of those guys for his particular weight class. And Lara and Rigondeaux are an expert at setting up certain traps within that of the long range or on the back foot or running you into certain shots, and sometimes also within the mid-range as well. Morrell does not have any of that. And that pretty much ended up, I pretty much ended up being proven correct on that account. But it is what it is, at least in my personal view. To pretty much end this video off, many people stated that this was quote-unquote fight of the year, or that this was up there with Golovkin and Canelo and, Ward and Kovalev. Personally, I don't think that it was up with those fights at all. I think that this fight was a clear main dominance fight by David Benavidez. I think that a big part of the reason why he didn't get the stoppage is because his stamina looked very compromised compared to what he was at the other weight class. And I think that had his stamina been, even only 10% less affected, I think that he would have got the stoppage. But David Benavidez, man, he looked like his gas tank was clearly way worse than what it was at 168. I did not expect it to have that same effect. I do not think that this was a quote unquote fight of the year. I also don't think that this was up there with Golovkin or Canelo or Kovalev versus Ward or any one of those fights. I don't think it's up there at all. I think it's one of those little fights that people overall think is better than what it actually is because they've seen David Benavidez get knocked down in the fight, and of course Morrell had his moments, and Benavidez didn't look really quite the same. I think that that's really the main reason. If I were really to compare this fight, in any direction, I mean, or to any particular fight, I'm not really quite sure what I would, say on the surface, but I've seen certain fights like this where people try to make it more competitive than what it actually was because, they wanted that fight to be great. But in my personal view, the fight just really wasn't that great. I think that it was a very entertaining fight, but to state that it's up there as one of the greatest fights of all time, it's a good little fight, but I don't think it's up there. When you talk about Canelo and Golovkin, that was actually two elite level boxers actually showing great level skill, and it was great craft between the two of them. When you talk about, that of, even a Fury versus Usyk, or, a Sugar Ray Leonard versus Tommy Hearns, or, a Andre Ward versus Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, all those fights in my personal view were better than this one. This pretty much was just a fighter that, pretty much mainly dominating a fighter that, in my view, looked relatively one-dimensional. At least that's just my analyzation of it. I know a lot of people are going to think that I'm being a little bit too harsh there, but, I mean, if you disagree, you'd have to tell me why you disagree. Because Morrell pretty much, in my personal case of just looking at the fight, he didn't really prove to me to be anything more than what I thought that he was this whole entire time, which is a fighter that is nowhere near as talented nor as skilled as what people try to make him out to be. But it is what it is. But anyways, we'll see where both of these fighters go. And keep in mind that I'm not trying to hate on David Morrell or anything like that. I just don't ever think that he was the fighter that many people try to state that he was. But, it is what it is. But anyways, let's see what ends up happening with both of these fighters. It's going to be very particularly interesting to see what happens next. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.